Prime Minister Mark Carney has appointed Marc-André Blanchard, a Trudeau-era insider with influence since 2015, as his new chief of staff.
An Ontario judge recently deemed a loaded illegal firearm inadmissible evidence against a black driver, ruling Peel Police racially profiled him during the traffic stop.
Air Canada's first all-2S LGBTQIA+ flight, Pride Post, faced immediate backlash online from Canadians, leading the airline to disable comments. Hello Canada, it's Tuesday, June 3rd, and this is the True North Daily Brief. I'm Cosmin, Dzsurdzsa.
And I'm Geoff Knight.
We've got you covered with all the news you need to know. Let's discuss the top stories of the day and the True North exclusives you won't hear anywhere else. Prime Minister Mark Carney has quietly installed Marc-André Blanchard as his chief of staff, a shadowy Trudeau-era insider who's wielded influence over the makeup of cabinet since former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's rise to power in 2015. Canada's former representative to the United Nations will officially take over the top role in the Prime Minister's office in July, replacing former Liberal MP Marco Mendicino, who is stepping down as Carney's interim chief of staff and is widely expected to run for Toronto mayor in 2026. While the appointment was briefly mentioned in a social media post, what went unsaid speaks volumes. Blanchard is no ordinary staffer. He played the role of gatekeeper for consecutive cabinets during Trudeau's multiple terms in office. Blanchard's name first surfaced in Liberal transition documents following the 2015 election, where he was enlisted to personally vet Trudeau's cabinet ministers, interviewing candidates to assess their ideological alignment and detect any, quote, skeletons in the closet. The Globe and Mail reported in 2019 that Trudeau sought to put Blanchard in an official top advisory position, replacing longtime friend and advisor Gerald Butts. Though the plan was never formalized publicly, insiders say Blanchard remained a trusted voice in Trudeau's ear, and now seemingly Carney's. Blanchard has acted as an informal advisor to Trudeau in the past, advising his cabinet appointments and decision-making, similar to current Prime Minister Mark Carney, who acted as an economic advisor. He shares similar views with Carney on the climate agenda and has appeared on multiple globalist sustainability forums boasting about net zero policies and measures. Blanchard also previously held an executive role at the CDPQ Global Investment Group, which has collaborated on multiple projects with Carney's former company Brookfield Asset Management. Blanchard's appointment comes as Carney prepares for a meeting with Canada's premiers today and a G7 summit in Kananaskis, Alberta, later this month. So, Geoff, this is quite the change-up in the Prime Minister's office. Carney is fleshing out his top team, and he's replacing former cabinet minister and Liberal MP Marco Mendicino with Blanchard. So why was Mendicino's time as chief of staff so short-lived?
Yeah, Cosmin. Marco Mendicino's tenure as Mark Carney's chief of staff was short-lived due to a combination of his interim roles, predefined timeline, and his own political ambitions. Mendicino was appointed as a temporary chief of staff following Carney's election in April, with the understanding that he would serve only until the end of June, as noted in a statement by Carney on social media in May. This brief stint was intended to cover the intense post-election transition period, leveraging Mendicino's familiarity with the Liberal caucus and his prior security clearance. But it was always meant to be a stopgap while Carney searched for a permanent replacement, which turned out to be Marc-André Blanchard starting in July. Additionally, Mendicino's departure aligns with his reported plans to run for Toronto mayor in 2026. Having resigned his seat in the House of Commons upon taking the chief of staff role, Mendicino had signaled his exit from federal politics earlier this year, criticizing the Trudeau government's stance on Israel in a January statement and choosing not to run in the 2025 election. His interim role allowed him to bridge his federal career to take a new chapter, with insiders noting his long-standing interest in municipal leadership, making his short tenure a strategic stepping stone rather than a reflection of any failure in the position. Ontario Superior Court Justice Renu Mandahane disqualified a loaded illegal gun as evidence in a case against a black driver, ruling that Peel Police engaged in racial profiling when they stopped the suspect. Mandahane described racial profiling as a systemic and intractable problem within Peel Regional Police. The judge's decision resulted in the exclusion of the firearm from evidence, ending the prosecution. This has drawn sharp criticism from federal Conservative candidate for Oakville East and former Peel Police officer Ron Chinzer, who called the ruling, quote, one of the most outrageous judicial outcomes in recent memory. According to Dzsurdzsa, the stop occurred when a Peel police officer, who is South Asian, conducted a lawful traffic stop after his onboard system flagged a Jeep registered to an individual with a suspended driver's license and outstanding drug charges. The driver was arrested for driving while suspended. During a routine inventory search that occurs before towing a vehicle, officers found a loaded firearm concealed under debris in the back of the Jeep. The court, however, found the officer's actions were tainted by racial bias, citing a comparison to an earlier stop the same day where the officer did not handcuff a white female driver. Justice Mandahane ruled that this disparity supported a finding of systemic racial profiling. Mandahane was appointed to the Ontario Superior Court in 2020 by former Liberal Justice Minister David Lametti, who was also responsible for Bill C-75 bail reform, dubbed by critics as the catch and release law, which allows violent criminals to go free by seeking bail. The Department of Justice admitted earlier this year that it does not track bail data. Before her appointment, she served as the Chief Commissioner of the Ontario Human Rights Commission, where she led inquiries into systemic discrimination. So, Cosmin, were there any other startling points of the judge's decision that raised eyebrows?
Yeah, so I think the main one is the inference of racial profiling without any direct evidence. And it's ironic that she decides to throw out a piece of clear evidence, a loaded, illegally obtained firearm in this individual's vehicle, based on this spurious conclusion that this officer racially profiled this individual. And what's more is that this officer, his name is Anand Gandhi, is not a white person himself. So she actually acknowledges this in the ruling. She writes, while Officer Gandhi's racial bias was likely unconscious and the product of our culture and his own worldview, that is not an excuse or even a mitigating factor in terms of the seriousness of the conduct. And she adds that Gandhi is himself racialized. He is a brown man, but this does not insulate him from the insidious power of anti-Black racism, stereotype, and racial bias. So what I take from this is that there is some permeating evil force of anti-Black racism that somehow touches officers, whether they're brown, black, or white, and influences their views. And it's sort of like this mystical thinking. And the fact that this made it into a court of law is quite outstanding and just really strikes at the root of the flawed thinking some of these judges who end up in these positions rely on. And it really is rooted in this progressive ideology and this belief that systemic racism is a permeating force in society. And the concept of systemic racism is central to this ruling. She frames the entire case through a lens of systemic anti-Black racism, and given her past activist role as a quasi-judge at the Ontario Human Rights Commission, let's remember that that is a extrajudicial tribunal, not an actual court of law, so to speak, in the traditional sense. She views everything clearly through this lens. And additionally, the dismissal of the officer's testimony as biased. Like, what are you supposed to take as evidence and testimony in a clear case like this if you can't take the fact that there's a loaded weapon in the car, that the officer provides an honest testimony in this case, and you, as a judge, she just writes it all off as biased and the result of systemic racism and intergenerational trauma affecting this individual? None of those things are pertinent to the facts at hand, and it's quite a miscarriage of justice to dismiss what otherwise would be seriously incriminating evidence to let somebody off on a charge as serious as driving around with a loaded firearm. Air Canada's attempt to kick off Pride Month with a celebratory post about its first ever, quote, all 2S LGBTQIA plus flight backfired almost instantly, drawing a flood of critical responses from Canadians and prompting the airline to to shut down comments. The Monday post was flooded with negative replies, overwhelming the number of likes it received, which prompted the airline's social media team to turn off the replies a few hours after the post was initially published. Despite limiting who can reply a few hours after the post, the previous top comments remain active. Canadians offered their views in the replies before they were turned off, telling the airline to focus on safe air travel instead of identity politics. True North previously reported on widespread diversity, equity, and inclusion programs embedded throughout Canada's airline sector, including identity-based hiring targets and mandatory ideological training. Air Canada mandates employee training on microaggressions, allyship, and unconscious bias. The company employs a dedicated DEI sourcing manager and requires recruitment slates to include individuals from government-defined, quote, designated groups. WestJet, on the other hand, has implemented genderless uniforms and has boasted about flights staffed entirely by female crews. Transat mandates unconscious bias workshop, and Flair has hosted pride flights in alignment with LGBT activism. Sunwing, meanwhile, became the first airline to implement a gender-neutral pilot dress code and has hosted promotional flights led by all-black crews. It increasingly seems to be the case, and we see this play out time and time again, that when companies, major corporations, embrace these explicit and overt shows of woke, whatever you want to call it, gender ideology, etc., these virtue signaling displays, it almost immediately backfires on them. So Geoff, just looking through the post and some of the comments, what were some of the most frequent replies to Air Canada?
Yeah, these replies all indicate a strong preference for merit-based hiring and operational focus over diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. A recurring sentiment is the demand for competence and safety in aviation, with users emphasizing that qualifications should be the sole criterion for roles like pilots and crew, as seen in comments like, "I just want someone who can fly the darn plane," and "I want the best people in those jobs, not people that are there to fill quotas." Many express frustration that DEI policies might compromise safety, with one user stating, "Encouraging DEI policies in aviation is going to equate to DIE." Another dominant theme is outright rejection of DEI and woke agendas, often coupled with a call for airlines to prioritize passenger experience over social initiatives. Replies like, "All airlines need to stop this BS and think about passenger safety," and shrinking room in airplane seats, now DEI in positions that demand merit. This has to end. These highlight frustrations with perceived distractions from core responsibilities, such as timely flights and customer service. Some users also express a willingness to avoid Canadian airlines entirely, with comments like, "I guess I'll have to check US airlines when I travel," and "I'm never traveling by train again." The replies reflect a deep skepticism of DEI in aviation, prioritizing merit and safety above all else.
That's it for today, folks. Thanks for tuning in. You can stay on top of new episodes every weekday by subscribing to the Daily Brief on iTunes and Spotify. Also, while you're at it, make sure to hit us with a 5-star rating and please leave a review.